Okay, let's dive deep today into something that shapes lives, often in ways we don't even see.
Right, trauma.
Yeah, but we're not just exploring it as, a psychological idea.
Hmm.
We're really unpacking this profound truth that trauma lives on, not just in our thoughts, but deep within the body itself.
It gets lodged there.
Exactly. And our guide for this is Bessel van der Kolk's huge book, The Body Keeps the Score. We're pulling key ideas from excerpts, crafting this deep dive just for you, the listener, to really navigate this complex stuff.
And our mission really is to distill the essence from these parts of the book. We want to trace that journey van der Kolk lays out, from those early days of trying to figure out trauma treatment.
Which often miss the mark.
Completely, all the way through the science showing how it physically impacts the brain and body, and then exploring the different ways people actually heal. We'll touch on the big areas the book covers.
And that core idea, the one that just shifts everything, it's right there in the title, isn't it? The body remembers, even when the conscious mind can't or won't.
It's powerful, sometimes unsettling, but yeah, that's the starting point.
So let's start where the book kind of does, with
Sure.
just how hard it was to even see trauma clearly. There's the story of Tom, the Vietnam vet.
Right. Years after the war.
Yeah, he's a lawyer, looks functional on the outside, but inside, a total mess. Simple things, fireworks, noise, even summer heat.
Givers.
Big time. Sent him right back. Couldn't connect with his family, just hid out, drinking. Described it as living behind a glass wall. Felt frozen inside.
And the thing is, the psychiatric world back then, it was just not equipped. Van der Kolk talks about searching the VA library, finding nothing on what they used to call shell shock or battle fatigue.
Wow. Nothing.
Basically nothing current. He had to dig up Abram Gardner's work on WWI vets from the 40s. It just shows this massive gap. The war ended, guys were suffering, and the system hadn't caught up.
And it wasn't just soldiers. The book points out this societal discomfort we have with trauma in general. War, abuse, violence.
Mm.
We kind of want to look away.
Yeah, we distance ourselves. Think it happens over there.
Which makes it so much harder for survivors to face their own experiences. So they cope how they can. Drugs, alcohol, self-harm sometimes. Anything to numb that internal reality.
Absolutely. And because of that lack of understanding, people like Tom got slapped with other labels: alcoholism, depression, bipolar.
Whatever fit the symptoms superficially.
Exactly. Treatments were often just heavy meds that fogged them up, or talk therapy that sometimes made things worse by triggering flashbacks without the tools to handle them. The medical model missed the whole picture, the context, the root cause.
There's that really tough story about Sylvia, the young woman in the hospital. Mute, refusing food.
Oh yeah, that one hits hard.
And the doctors, meaning, well, they force-fed her, restrained her. Only later do they find out about her horrific abuse history.
And the chilling part is realizing that act of care, the overpowering, the restraint must have felt terrifyingly familiar. It likely replicated her original trauma.
Which leads to that crucial, gut-wrenching lesson he shares. If you're doing something to a patient you wouldn't do to a friend or your own kid, pause. Are you maybe unconsciously re-traumatizing them? It really challenges approaches that aren't built on safety first.
And understanding why these things happen, why trauma has such a grip, takes us right into the brain. Chapter 5 really unpacks this. The brain's number one job: survival. Period.
Everything else is secondary.
Totally. Thinking, connecting, planning, all that takes a backseat if the brain thinks you're in danger. It's constantly managing internal signals, mapping the world, getting energy ready, spotting threats, adjusting action.
And trauma throws a wrench in all of that.
Every single function. It messes with the fundamental survival machinery. At the core is what the book calls the emotional brain, the older parts: reptilian brain, limbic system.
The stuff that runs on instinct.
Pretty much. It's scanning constantly. Safe, danger, opportunity. It releases hormones, creates those gut feelings, those visceral sensations, unease, fear, excitement. It drives so many of our immediate, often unconscious reactions.
This is where mirror neurons come in, right? The neural Wi-Fi idea.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. These neurons let us tune into others, feel their feelings, mirror their movements, sense their intentions. It's the basis for empathy, for feeling connected.
So trauma is like an attack on that connection system.
Often, yes. It can involve a major failure of mirroring, of not being seen or responded to safely. So healing has to involve reactivating that capacity, learning to feel seen safely, but also learning not to get swamped by other people's distress.
Right, finding that balance.
And how the brain handles incoming info is key. Everything we sense, sights, sounds, smells, goes through the thalamus. The book calls it the cook.
Mixing all the ingredients into an experience.
Exactly. And from there, info splits. There's a fast track, the low road, straight to the amygdala.
The smoke detector?
Danger.
Right. And a slightly slower track, the high road, up to the prefrontal cortex where we can think consciously, make sense of things.
Okay, so what happens in trauma? That thalamus processing can break down. The cook gets overwhelmed. Sensory input becomes fragmented. Memories aren't stored as a coherent story.
More like snapshots or feelings.
Exactly. Raw sensations, images, sounds, smells, physical feelings, and time just freezes around them. They don't get tagged as past.
And that directly kicks off the body's alarm system. Fight or flight.
Will freeze. Yeah, it's automatic, wired into the oldest brain parts. Energy gets diverted away from the thinking brain, primes the body for action. If you escape, great, the system resets.
But if you're trapped, overwhelmed,
Then the system can get stuck on. You become hypervigilant, always scanning for threats, even when safe. Your body keeps reacting as if the danger is still present, like a conditioned response to ghosts.
so understanding that gives us clues for healing.
Definitely. It points to two main routes. Top down, using the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, to try and manage the reactions, calm things down from above.
Makes sense.
And bottom up, working directly with those older brain regions through the body. Breathing, movement, touch, rhythm, sound. Engaging the physical systems that regulate arousal.
And that bottom-up approach is often missed in standard therapy.
Historically, yes. But it's crucial for trauma. It sets the stage for so many effective treatments we'll talk about. Which brings us nicely to diagnosis, Chapter 9. Getting PTSD into the official diagnostic manual, the DSM-3, back in 1980, that was huge.
Even if the diagnosis itself wasn't perfect initially.
Right. It had limitations, especially for complex trauma, but just having it legitimize trauma clinically. And the big insight here is how that official recognition unlocked resources. The DoD, the VA, they poured money into PTSD research.
Which then helped everyone, not just veterans.
Exactly. It spurred studies, led to effective treatments that benefited survivors of all kinds of trauma.
And early studies started noticing differences, right? Like the Spitzer Project.
Yeah, they interviewed hundreds of patients and saw patterns. People whose trauma came from childhood abuse looked different from those who experienced domestic violence or a natural disaster. It hinted that maybe a single PTSD label wasn't capturing everything, especially for chronic relational trauma.
Then came the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. That one really shifted things.
Groundbreaking, truly. And what was so striking was the population, not specifically high-risk folks, mostly white, middle-class, educated people.
Results were
Startling. 2/3 reported at least one ACE. Only 1/3 reported none. It showed just how common these difficult experiences are, even in supposedly stable environments. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. The rates were much higher than people thought.
wow.
And the critical insight wasn't just the prevalence, but how these experiences cluster. They're interconnected. Abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, parental mental illness, or substance abuse,
Yeah.
they often go together, and they're cumulative.
They pile up.
Right. The more ACEs someone has, the greater the cumulative toll over their life.
And the study showed that toll isn't just mental health, right? It goes way beyond that.
Oh, absolutely. High ACE scores correlated strongly with learning and behavior problems in school, difficulties at work, financial instability later on.
But also physical health, decades later.
Yes. Things like heart disease, emphysema, autoimmune diseases, chronic bronchitis. It was undeniable proof that early adversity gets under the skin, biologically, and has long-term physical consequences. The body really does keep the score.
Which leads to that really interesting clinical idea the book raises, that sometimes the problem is actually the solution.
Ah, yes. That's a profound one. The example of the woman whose severe obesity was maybe unconsciously serving a protective function.
And when she lost the weight surgically, she became suicidal.
Exactly. The obesity was removed, but the underlying issue, the trauma it was potentially managing, wasn't addressed. It highlights the danger of just treating symptoms without understanding their function. You might take away someone's only coping mechanism, however maladaptive, without offering a safer one.
And this really shows why standard diagnoses can fall short, especially for kids with complex trauma. They end up with this alphabet soup of labels.
ADHD, ODD, anxiety, depression, PTSD.
Right. Like Anthony in the book, who's basically just scared to death and fighting for his life, but got labeled with multiple disorders. Or Maria, with her history of severe abuse and multiple placements. The labels didn't capture the core reality.
No, they focus on surface behaviors and miss the underlying developmental disruption, the constant state of fear these kids live in.
Which is why the proposed diagnosis, developmental trauma disorder, DTD, was so important.
Yes, it aimed to actually capture that reality of chronic interpersonal trauma in childhood. The criteria looked at the experiences, the violence, the disrupted caregiving, and the specific developmental impacts. Trouble with regulation, relationships, sense of self.
So the insight is it shifts the focus.
Exactly. Away from just symptom management towards healing the fundamental damage to the developing child caused by that relational trauma. Addressing the root, not just the branches. And the biology backs this up more and more. The book mentions genetics, epigenetics, how stress literally changes how our genes get expressed.
Without changing the DNA code itself.
Right. Experiences, especially early ones, can chemically tag DNA and alter its function. Studies on kids whose moms went through the Quebec ice storm while pregnant, or Moshe Seif's work showing gene changes linked to abuse. It's powerful evidence.
Even animal studies.
Yeah, the rhesus monkey studies showing how early experiences shape biology and even temperament, making some more anxious or aggressive. It just hammers home how deeply biological trauma is.
Okay, so let's talk about traumatic memory itself. The book stresses how often trauma is, well, pre-verbal, beyond words.
Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee, Macbeth. Right?
Yeah, victims sitting mute, kids losing their language. They can't tell the story because it wasn't encoded as a story.
Exactly. It's embodied memory, stored in sensations, images, impulses, movements, not in the narrative centers of the brain. Think of Charcot's early work on hysteria.
Like Lelog, the guy paralyzed after an accident.
Right. No physical injury explained it. He couldn't remember the event, just fragments the cartwheels turning. The memory was in his body in the paralysis.
And this understanding was key to the whole talking cure idea, wasn't it? Freud, Brewer.
Yeah, they built on that work, their big insight. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. They notice traumatic memories don't fade like normal ones. They stay intense, vivid, but are often walled off from conscious recall.
Stored differently.
Completely differently. And because they're not integrated, not part of a narrative, people often end up reliving aspects through reenactment.
Repeating patterns without knowing why.
Exactly. Doing things, putting themselves in situations that somehow echo the original drama, like the veteran staging the armed robbery near the anniversary of his friend's death.
And the danger there is misunderstanding it.
Huge danger. If you don't know the history, you might see the behavior as pathology or delinquency or just plain weird. You punish or label the reenactment instead of seeing it as a coded message from the past, an attempt to process or master something unbearable.
Which connects to that whole complicated area of repressed or recovered memories.
Right. The book makes the point that memory loss for trauma, especially childhood sexual abuse, isn't some fringe idea. It's documented in scientific literature. Dissociative amnesia has been in the DSM criteria since 1980.
So the phenomenon itself is real, even if there are debates about how memories are recovered.
Precisely. The insight is that forgetting traumatic events, partially or wholly, is a known response. And a memory study the book describes really clarifies how these memories differ. Right after the trauma, people were often stunned, silent, couldn't tell a story.
Just flashbacks.
Exactly. Intrusive images, sounds, physical sensations, intense emotions. Later, they might be able to construct some kind of narrative account.
The memory of the trauma.
Right. But often, the raw sensory and emotional pieces become even more intense, more easily triggered over time. Nancy's quote is so evocative. Flashbacks making time fold, symbols getting contaminated.
Yeah, it captures how it's not a memory you recall, it's something that invades the present.
Perfectly put, it invades. Okay, so let's shift gears. How do we heal? How do we befriend the emotional brain, as the book puts it?
Beyond just medication, right?
Yeah, while meds have a role, the book really emphasizes tapping into the body's own built-in self-regulation tools. The vagus nerve is central here.
The big nerve connecting brain and body.
Yep, and crucially, about 80% of its fibers run from the body up to the brain, which means...
Working with the body directly changes the brain.
Exactly. Things like breathing exercises, chanting, rhythmic movement. These aren't just alternative practices. They work because they directly engage and retrain that physiological arousal system via the vagus nerve. It's bottom-up regulation.
Makes sense. So a big piece of healing is learning to actually feel things safely. Sensations, emotions.
Huge. Because often the response to trauma is either numbing out.
Like addiction, eating disorders, self-harm like skin picking. Sherry's story.
Right. Or the opposite, intense sensation seeking. Needing extreme risks just to feel alive or in control.
Two sides of the same coin. trying to manage unbearable internal states.
Often, yes. They're desperate attempts to regulate internal chaos, even if they create other problems. They can offer a false sense of control. So a starting point for real control is mindfulness, paying attention to the body.
Yes, specifically focusing on physical sensations, just noticing them, labeling them without judgment. This simple act starts to calm the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response.
Like Annie's yoga experience, noticing her breath, feeling sensations, but realizing she could just observe them without fear.
Exactly, that quote about her body holding experiences, but she could be present with them. It's powerful. The insight is you have to build that capacity to safely be in your body before you can really process the past stored there.
You can't revisit trauma if just feeling your heartbeat sends you into panic.
Right. And this healing journey, it rarely happens alone. Connection is key.
Finding a responsive community, safe relationships, absolutely vital. Support groups offer that peer understanding. And skilled therapists create that contained space to touch on the really painful stuff.
The book even mentions the author's own reaction to a veteran's story.
Yeah, triggering his own flashback. It underscores how important it is for therapists to do their own work, to be able to hold space for someone else's horror without getting completely overwhelmed themselves. You need that internal capacity.
Okay, let's talk specific therapies. Internal family systems, IFS. That sounds intriguing.
It really is. The basic idea is that the mind isn't unified. It's more like an internal family with different parts.
Not like multiple personalities, though.
No, not pathological. More like different modes of being, different aspects of self. Think of the Mary Jane example. One part of her was shy, another more provocative. These parts aren't just feelings. They have beliefs, intentions, agendas. They develop for a reason, usually protective.
Okay, so how does trauma fit in?
Trauma forces these parts into extreme roles. They become polarized, intense self-criticism living alongside grandiosity maybe, or extreme rage next to complete shutdown. The whole internal system gets disrupted, and we often blend with a part.
Meaning we think we are that part. Like, I am worthless.
Exactly. Instead of recognizing a part of me feels worthless, IFS helps create that separation.
And the core idea is that underneath all that, there's an undamaged self.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the really hopeful core of IFS. Beneath the protective parts and the wounded child parts, there's this inherent self, calm, curious, compassionate, confident. It's always there, just maybe obscured.
So the goal is to help the protectors relax enough to let the self lead.
Precisely. To build trust so the self can connect with and heal the wounded parts. The process involves identifying a part, getting curious about it, understanding its positive intention, even if its methods are problematic now.
Like Peter and his critical part.
Yeah, realizing its job was to push people away to avoid getting hurt. Understanding that allowed the physical tension to ease. And research backs it up that RA study showed IFS improved pain, function, and self-compassion. That last one is key.
Healing involves being kinder to yourself.
Fundamentally. Another really body-focused approach is psychomotor therapy, Pesso's work. It deals with that inner void, the feeling of not being seen, wanted, protected early on.
And it uses role-playing, tableaus.
Right, structures. Group members play roles, including crucial ones like ideal parents or supportive figures who provide what was missing back then.
So it's not just talking about it, it's experiencing something different.
Exactly. It lets you feel what you felt, see a corrective scene unfold, say what couldn't be said. It's about physically, emotionally rewriting pivotal moments.
Like Maria having an ideal mother finally stand up to her abusive father in the structure.
Yes. Or Mark confronting his father and feeling his own fear and rage in a safe way. People describe this profound, visceral sense of relief, of unburdening. The insight is that the body needs to experience safety and completion to truly let go of the past.
And the book also revisits things like yoga and neurofeedback as healing tools.
Right, bringing it back to those bottom-up regulators, yoga helps people reconnect with their body safely, manage arousal through breath and posture. Neurofeedback directly trains brainwave patterns.
Helping calm hyperarousal, reduce dissociation.
Exactly. Lisa's quote about it freeing her up to live her life, not being stuck in fight or flight. It shows the potential of directly retraining the brain's activity. And then there's the power of community, of shared rhythm and performance. Things like the theater of war.
Where actors and veterans perform Greek tragedies together.
Yeah, tapping into those timeless stories of war, loss, suffering. It creates this incredibly powerful shared space. Nick's transformation in the book is a great example.
It makes you wonder if those ancient Greek plays served a similar purpose for their veterans, right?
Could be. And think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu using collective singing and dancing during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
To help people manage the horror as they testify.
Exactly. That shared rhythm, that physical expression, allows people to pendulate, to touch the trauma, but then come back to the present, back to the group, without getting completely submerged. Healing is so often relational and embodied.
Yeah.
These theater programs also give participants a sense of agency, cause and effect. You learn lines, you perform an action, you get a result. That's huge for people, especially kids whose early lives felt chaotic and unpredictable.
Gives them back some control over the narrative.
Precisely. Paul's quote is key. You don't fix them, you work side by side with them. Like Larry embodying Brutus or Tina feeling like she was changing the story through performance. It's empowering.
Okay, taking a quick pause here. If you're finding this deep dive into understanding trauma and healing helpful, if these ideas are resonating with you, please just take a second to click that like button. It really helps us know what you find valuable. And hey, if you want to keep exploring complex topics like this one, definitely hit subscribe so you don't miss out.
Right, and all these threads, the brain science, the memory research, the diverse therapies, they lead us to think about the bigger picture, the societal implications, becoming a trauma-conscious society.
Which means looking at the roots, right? Poverty, unemployment, isolation,
Right.
the conditions that breed trauma.
Exactly. Because, as the book starkly puts it, trauma breeds further trauma. Hurt people hurt other people. We have to address the systemic issues and support healing, or the cycle just keeps going.
That idea of Ubuntu from South Africa seems so relevant here. My humanity is inextricably bound up in yours.
It's profound. It means individual healing and collective healing are inseparable. We can't truly heal if we don't recognize our shared humanity and interconnectedness.
Makes total sense. We're social creatures, wired for connection. And trauma just devastates that system.
It really does. Yet so many institutions, schools, the justice system, sometimes even healthcare, they focus on managing behavior and skip right over emotional engagement and safety.
Missing the fundamental point.
Missing that feeling safe with other people is the absolute foundation of mental health. Safe connection isn't optional, it's essential.
So applying this to schools,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
It means training everyone, teachers, staff, bus drivers, to recognize trauma signs. It means prioritizing safety, predictability, routine, making sure kids feel seen, known, greeted by name, checked in on.
So behavior problems are seen differently.
Yes. Not as defiance, but potentially as signals of a dysregulated nervous system overwhelmed by trauma.
Which means punishment isn't the answer.
Often it makes things worse. It re-traumatizes. A trauma-informed response is about recognizing the distress, helping the child regulate maybe through movement, a quiet space, sensory tools, then exploring what happened and finding solutions. Safety and connection first, always. And recognizing sometimes home isn't safe.
Yeah, it's a whole different approach.
And it's interesting looking at the book's acknowledgement.
Like the different influences.
Right. Body workers, yoga teachers, neurofeedback folks, IFS developers, theater people. It shows this work isn't confined to one discipline. Healing trauma requires this rich, multifaceted perspective.
And ultimately, he comes back to the patients. They were the real teachers.
Yeah, calling them his true textbook.
Yeah.
And affirming that deep driving life force that pushes people towards healing, towards creating meaning even after terrible things. It leaves you with hope, doesn't it? About resilience.
It really does. So wrapping up, we've journeyed from understanding trauma's physical imprint, how it changes the brain and fragments memory, through the challenges of diagnosis and into this diverse landscape of healing, bottom-up regulation, internal parts work, embodied action, the power of community.
And the core message running through it all seems to be integration. Integrating the past, reclaiming the body, rebuilding safe connections. It's a whole person process.
Which leaves us with a big question, maybe something for you, the listener, to really chew on. What would actually change in our communities, our schools, our relationships, even just our own lives, if we truly embrace this idea, lived by it the knowledge that the body keeps the score? How might things be different? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We really hope it's given you some valuable things to think about, maybe spark some curiosity to learn even more. And if you did find this exploration valuable, please give us that like. It genuinely helps us figure out what kind of deep dives resonate most. And of course, hit subscribe so you catch our future explorations.